Yeah.
Is that in the Summer Palace, by
Summer,
the way?
yes. Yes.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
the outdoor walkway. I like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
And it's long, it's a
Yeah,
long walkway. So
yeah,
and the
yeah.
all the paintings throughout, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm.
Okay, but like I said, it shouldn't affect our time. If I need to change time,
No,
I'll contact
you
you.
let me know. You will let me
Yeah.
know.
Okay.
Absolutely. Well, you'll be in Beijing.
Yeah, I will mainly just visiting my parents. They're getting
Excellent.
old, so I use the cheap ticket
Mm,
right now. It's a slow season, so it's a ticket is
no.
good. So I just go whenever I can. Yeah.
Tell me, as somebody who has read massively on old Chinese history, is there still the strong feeling of connection between parents and children in China that was such an important part of Chinese culture before?
Yes, and it's just still common. Like when children get
Mm,
married, they live with their parents. It's still common.
right.
Not as common as it's used to in particular
Yeah.
big cities and for various
Mm,
reasons. And when people leaving their, villages or small towns, and then their parents and children are living separately. But if they are in the same city, it's there you can still see certain parts of China that's pretty common. And so,
mm.
yeah, and then, my parents, for example, they still like to get into my business, sometimes for good, sometimes not so good.
I can imagine. Yes, I can
So
imagine.
yeah,
Anyway,
in
here I
particular,
am. Here we are.
yeah, in particular, my mother, I would say she's totally fine. I'm here, far away from her, but as
Yeah,
soon as I'm, visiting her, she want to arrange
yeah,
everything for me, like I can't
yeah,
handle things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. One of
So
the things, by the way, that I've had to explain many times to Westerners, is that if you talk about Chinese history, one of the most striking things about it, especially compared with the medieval and early modern history of the West, is how many extremely strong women there
mhm.
have been in Chinese history. And by the way, how very strong I understand women have been within families, just to say,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
especially mothers,
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
also say.
Yeah, not least in the royal families, the mothers of the
Absolutely.
king, of the emperor,
Yeah,
they trying to get into the business, and there is
absolutely.
actually a real emperor, right? Wu
Yeah,
Zetian during the Tang Dynasty. Now
that's right.
she's also very controversial because she's not part of the Li family, the royal
Yeah.
family, but she has a
Mm.
different family name. But nonetheless, she was mother of the emperor, and then eventually she became the empress herself. So,
Absolutely, and as I said, a great ruler apparently, and
yeah.
a rather terrifying figure, and a very important person in terms of art and culture, and of course, I don't know. Have you ever heard of Judge D? He's a sort of
Judge D.
Judge D, Chinese. He's based on an actual Chinese scholar
Uh-huh.
official of the Tang period,
Yeah.
but in the 1950s and 60s, a Dutch um, scholar who loved China very much
Hmm.
and knew China very well. Anyway, he wrote a whole series of detective stories
Hmm.
based on this man,
Yeah.
in which he presented him as having being an official in various Chinese towns, all invented, by the way. And he
Well,
created all kinds of stories about these detective feats. And of course, they happened during the time of Wu Zetian's reign.
yeah, Di Renjie, I think the original person's name, he is a real official, high official
Mm,
working
yeah,
for Wu Zetian.
mm,
And Wu
that's it.
Zetian like him because he's not part of the royal family. He actually
Mm,
coming from grassroots, from
mm,
commoner. That background, actually, Wu Zetian likes that. And during
yeah,
her time, it's because she herself is kind of like do not want to be controlled by the royal family. She
mm,
likes to promote people from the grassroots, those people,
there
regular
you go.
people. Yeah. So that's interesting aspect of her ruling. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay.
Anyway,
Okay. Let's start with the election. So Georgia just had election, and can we say that the West failed trying to duplicate what happened in 2014, the Maidan coup. Can we say that?
So far, yes, and I think they're going to continue to fail. First of all, I think I should just say that I've been in touch with many people, including many people from Georgia. I mean, Greeks and Georgians have very strong connections with each other. We have a history of interaction that goes back to about, well, the equivalent, the exact historical time would be the time of the Warring States in China. So that gives you an idea of how long our interactions have been. The Georgian people are a major presence in Greek mythology, for example, just to say. So I know a lot of people from Georgia. I've had a lot of contacts with people in Georgia. They all tell me the same thing. The election was genuine. The result is what is being reported. The Georgian political party that won, the Georgian government that won decisively, and that it has the strong support of most people in Georgia, including at least half the population of Tbilisi, which is the capital where the Western opposition is most strongly based. So what they are all saying is that if there is an attempt to reproduce in Georgia a kind of color revolution dynamic that we saw in Ukraine in 2014, what that would do is that it would trigger a consolidation of Georgian society behind the government, that in effect people in Georgia voted against the kind of political change that these forces support and want to carry out in Georgia.
And also in general, I feel like elections getting more and more complicated, turbulence in a way. Of course, the Ukraine election, we know it was a legitimate election and then later overthrown the elected president, Yanukovych. And then in 2018, the election in Venezuela, U.S. didn't recognize that, right? They recognized Juan Guaido, who I don't see any legitimacy of that, but U.S. recognized him. And they even confiscated the Venezuela embassy in Washington and give the power to Juan Guaido to control that. I think they give it back to Nicolas Maduro's government last year. But anyway, and then of course, the 2020, the US election didn't go very smoothly. So it seems like more and more we see elections that do not go very smoothly, or people do not recognize results. Is that what's going on right now?
That is absolutely what is going on right now, and of course, one has to understand that this isn't completely surprising, because of the extent to which elections now take place in two places simultaneously at one and the same time. So we're talking about an election in Georgia or an election in Venezuela or an election everywhere. There is the actual election which takes place in the country where people vote and they put their ballots then and decide whom they support. That's one election. And then simultaneously, there is the election that's conducted in the Western media, within the Western commentary class, within the Western intellectual community. And there, they are always commenting and discussing and also participating in the election. And of course, the results can be completely different. So the people in one country, let's say Georgia, might vote strongly in favor of one government, of a particular government, but the people who are participating in their own kind of way, remotely in the election, in the media and wherever in the West, they might be voting, in effect, I say voting in quotation marks, for a completely different political force, for an opposition that is connected to them. And of course, what they say, the people in the West say, is that it is their view of the election outcome which must prevail. It is their view which is the legitimate one, not the one of the people who actually voted in the country in question. So obviously, that creates complexity and tension, not least in the country itself. And what we saw in the United States in 2020 is the inevitable result of all of this. Mm-hmm. Because the same doubts and uncertainties and tensions between what the commentariat and the political elite in the West, the outcome they want and the outcome that people actually vote for, inevitably that has ended up being played out in the United States itself. Because, of course, if you go and do this sort of thing in all kinds of other countries, sooner or later, all of that's going to be imported back to your own.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think what happened in 2020 is the direct result. Remember, I think 2019 is what was happening in Hong Kong. The rioters, I mean, there is no better way to describe them. The so-called freedom fighters, right? The students, they attacked the government building. They did. And then I think shortly before that, it was something also, Belarus also had something. Also, people who are unhappy with the government. I mean, there is always somebody who's not happy with the government, right? They also, I think, did something similar. And then the CNN and all the other news media, they praises these kind of behavior. They think that's a good thing. Well, then the people in the US watched the 24 hours of this kind of thing. Well, if they are not happy with the results, of course, they feel like, well, we should do something too, right? I think it has a lot to do with it. But
absolutely, that's entirely my view. I mean, if you meddle and interfere and manipulate and control political and electoral processes in other places, or try to do so, then inevitably, sooner or later, all of that is going to be imported back into your own country. And of course, it's important to say, both in the United States and in other Western countries, that the kind of political technologies and the kind of people who are there orchestrating on the ground these events, including, by the way, in Hong Kong, well, of course, they come back to the United States itself, and they do them back in the United States or in Britain or anywhere else. It is the nature of politics. You can't be bad outside and good internally. The world isn't like that. You can't go around, subverting democracy, or let's not even talk about democracy. Subvert normal, lawful political process in one place and assume that it won't happen to your own place, because the people who do the one, on your behalf, will say, well, if we can do it in Hong Kong, why shouldn't we do it here?
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. Japan had election, a local, a parliamentary election, which the Liberal Democratic Party, they didn't get the majority of the seats, which I guess somewhat surprising. What is your take on that?
No, it is not surprising. Again, this is, in fact, to some extent, I was relieved by it, not just because of the result itself, which is a relief, but because it is actually consistent with what I used to hear from the kind of people that, 20, 30 years ago from Japan, I used to have dealings with, who used to tell me that, there are an awful lot of people in Japan who do not agree with this style of politics and the kind of people who do these kind of things. And they pointed out that when there were brief elections in the 1930s, it turned out even then that there was more opposition than the emperor and his regime were happy with, which is why all that had to be rolled back and why massive indoctrination campaigns were then launched. And it seems it's the same with Japan now. So I think the reason is very straightforward. I mean, we've had a period of relative economic stability in Japan. I mean, things have not been going especially well, but then they haven't been going especially well for a long time. But there are people in Japan who do understand that the policy that is being followed by the Japanese government over the last couple of years, very anti-China, very militaristic, very seeking confrontation, pursuing sanctions, doing all of these things, is not in Japan's interests. And they say, why? Why should we support these things? And enough of them voted to make a difference. Now, notice, by the way, that the coalition party that supports the Liberal Democrats is Komeito. Now, I used to know quite a few people, oddly enough, from Komeito for some reason. I mean, it's very much based around a Buddhist movement, which, to be frank, I didn't understand or especially like. But the point about Komeito in those days, we're talking about long ago, is that it was very, very strongly opposed to Japanese militarism and Japanese rearmament, and supported what was then conceived of as the peace constitution that Japan had. All of that seems to have fallen by the wayside. And I wouldn't be surprised also if Komeito, which seems to have shrunk a lot in size over the last 20 years, has also lost support because of its complete reversal of its policies that it used to have when it originally existed and when I once upon a time knew about it. So these results do not surprise me. How much difference in the end they're going to make, unfortunately, is another matter, because as we always see, in country after country that's aligned with the United States, an election may say one thing, the people may want something, but what the power does is more based on what Washington wants.
Yeah, I agree. I think it won't make much of a difference either way. Yeah, I agree.